"Boss, I know how to cure your son," said the simple mechanic to the factory owner. Richard Johnson carried his 3-year-old son Michael in his arms as he walked through the workshop of his own auto parts factory in Columbus. The boy, who once ran through the company's halls, was now motionless from the waist down after an accident that changed the entire family's life. The businessman had spent nearly $500,000 on the best specialists in the country, but all gave the same devastating verdict: there was no hope. That's when Frank Miller, a 42-year-old mechanic who had worked on the assembly line for nearly 20 years, approached with hands still dirty from grease. The simple man, wearing a worn-out cap and a patched blue jumpsuit, lightly touched his boss's arm. "Mr. Johnson, I know how to cure your son," Frank said, making all the workers around them stop what they were doing. Richard turned around furious, his eyes red from weeks of crying. How dare this employee interrupt his moment of grief with false hope? He had taken Michael to the best hospitals in New York, consulted renowned neurologists, and they had all been clear: the spinal injury was irreversible. "Frank, have you lost your mind?" Richard snapped with contained anger. "The best doctors in America have already examined my son. Do you really think a mechanic knows more than them?" Silence fell over the workshop. The other workers lowered their heads, fearing for their colleague's situation. But Frank didn't back down. There was something in his eyes Richard couldn't decipher, a mix of determination and knowledge that seemed out of place in that setting. "Boss, my brother went through the same thing when he was Michael's age," Frank continued, ignoring the disapproving glances from his co-workers. "Today, he walks just fine. Works at a construction site in Cincinnati." Michael, who had been quiet in his father's arms, turned his little head toward Frank and smiled. It was the first positive reaction the boy had shown in weeks. Richard's heart clenched. His wife Jennifer had forbidden any visits to the factory, saying an industrial environment wasn't the place for a child in recovery. But he had needed to get out of the house, needed to breathe. "What kind of exercises?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now. "Very simple movements, Mr. Johnson. Nothing that'll hurt him. My brother Brian couldn't move his legs for 3 months after falling from a tree. My mother took him to see an old man from the countryside, a Mr. Wilson. The man taught him some exercises that seemed silly, but..." "Silly is what you're saying right now," Richard interrupted, growing agitated again. "I won't expose my son to quackery." Frank took a deep breath and pulled his wallet from his back pocket. Carefully, he removed an old yellowed photo. In it, a boy of about 5 sat in a makeshift wheelchair made of wood and bicycle wheels. Beside it was the same boy, older, standing and smiling. "This is my brother Brian," Frank showed the photo. "Before and after." Richard took the photo with trembling hands. The resemblance between the boy in the picture and Michael was striking. Both were the same age when the accident happened. Both had been paralyzed the same way. "Where's your brother now?" Richard asked, his voice calmer. "He lives in Cincinnati, works at a construction company, has 3 kids, plays soccer every Sunday at the field near his house." Michael stretched his little arms toward the photo as if wanting to touch it. Richard looked at his son and made a decision that would change everything. "What do you want in return?" he asked, suspicious. "Nothing, boss. I just want to help. I know what it's like to see a child like this. I watched my mother cry every day for months." Richard hesitated. He knew Jennifer would be furious if she found out he was considering a mechanic's proposal. She had already spent a fortune hiring the best professionals, and any suggestion that didn't come from a renowned doctor was seen as an insult. "All right," Richard decided. "But if you hurt my son in any way, I guarantee you'll never work anywhere again." "Understood, Mr. Johnson. When would you like to start?" "Right now." Frank looked around the noisy, oil-scented workshop. "This won't do, boss. We need a quieter, cleaner place. Is there an admin office upstairs?" Richard nodded, and the two climbed the stairs toward the office. Michael seemed excited, babbling random words as he took in his surroundings. For weeks he'd been apathetic, showing no interest in anything. The admin office was simple: a wooden desk, a few chairs, and a window overlooking the factory yard. Frank asked Richard to place Michael on the floor, on a clean towel from the cabinet. "The first exercise is very simple," Frank explained, kneeling beside the boy. "I'll just massage his little legs very slowly." Old Mr. Wilson used to say we had to wake up the nerves that were asleep. Nerves that were asleep, Richard repeated skeptically. I know it sounds strange, boss, but that's how he explained it. Said sometimes the body forgets how to make things work, and we need to remind it. Frank began making circular motions on Michael's legs, starting at the hips and moving toward his feet. The boy giggled, thinking it was a game. Richard watched every move, tense and alert for any sign of discomfort from his son. Now I'll bend his little legs, very slowly, Frank continued. The key is to do it every day at the same time, with patience. The exercises lasted about 20 minutes. Michael seemed to enjoy it, laughing and trying to grab Frank's hands. When they finished, the mechanic stood and wiped his hands on his overalls. We'll do it again tomorrow, Mr. Johnson. And the day after too. Discipline is key. How long until we see any results? Richard asked, picking Michael up. My brother started moving his toes after 2 weeks, but every case is different. Richard left the factory that day with a strange feeling in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like hope. But he knew he couldn't tell Jennifer. She had forbidden any treatment not approved by the family's private neurologist, Dr. William Parker, one of the most respected in New York. At home, Jennifer noticed her husband was different. You seem livelier today, she remarked while preparing dinner. Did something happen at the factory? Nothing much, Richard lied. Just tied up some loose ends. Jennifer was an elegant, determined woman in her 40s. The daughter of a traditional Columbus family, she had married Richard when he was still building his business empire. In recent years, especially after Michael's accident, she had become more controlling, wanting to oversee every detail of their son's recovery. I spoke to Dr. Parker today, she said. He mentioned we could try an experimental surgery in Switzerland. It costs $200,000, but it might be our only chance. Richard nearly choked on his food. $200,000 was a lot of money, even for him. The factory had struggled during the recent crisis, and they'd already spent nearly everything on consultations and tests. Let's think it through carefully, Jennifer. You don't need to make hasty decisions. Hasty? She snapped. Richard, our son has been in a wheelchair for 2 months. Every day that passes could be crucial for his recovery. Michael, who was sitting in a special chair by the table, mumbled something and clapped his hands. Jennifer smiled for the first time that day. At least he's more cheerful today, she remarked. It must be because he got out of the house. That night, Richard had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about Frank's exercises, the photo of the mechanic's brother, the words about nerves being asleep. It seemed absurd, but at the same time, it made some sense. What if the doctors were wrong? What if there really was hope? The next day, Richard arrived early at the factory. Frank was already at his station, working on an engine part. When he saw his boss, he dropped everything and approached. Mr. Johnson, did you bring Michael today? No, my wife is suspicious. I'll have to come up with an excuse to bring him. Did you tell her about the exercises? I can't. She wouldn't understand. Frank nodded sympathetically. My sister-in-law didn't believe it at first either. She said my brother was wasting his time on nonsense, but when he started improving, she changed her mind. How did you convince her to let him continue? Actually, it was Brian who convinced her. He begged to keep doing the exercises, said he felt his legs tingling during the massages. Richard thought of Michael, how the boy had responded positively the day before. Maybe his own son could be the key to convincing Jennifer. I'll try to bring him tomorrow, Richard decided. That afternoon, Richard made up an important meeting at the factory and convinced Jennifer to let Michael stay with him for a few hours. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bennett, a 60-year-old woman who had worked with the family for over 10 years, was tasked with watching the boy at the factory. I don't understand why you insist on taking Michael to that place, Jennifer complained. A factory is no place for a child. He likes it there, Jennifer. He gets excited when he sees the machines working. But what if something happens? What if he gets hurt? Nothing will happen. I'll keep an eye on him the whole time. Jennifer gave in, but not without a list of instructions. Don't let Michael near the machines. Don't let him touch anything dirty. Give him his medicine at 2 in the afternoon. Change his diaper every 2 hours. At the factory, Richard took Michael straight to the office. Frank was already waiting, his hands clean and a fresh towel spread on the floor. "Hey there, Michael," Frank spoke to the boy warmly. "Ready to play again?" Michael smiled and reached his arms toward the mechanic. Richard was surprised by his son's reaction. For weeks, Michael hadn't shown affection for anyone but his parents. The second day's exercises were more elaborate. Frank massaged Michael's legs longer, did flexion and extension movements, and taught Richard how to do some of the exercises at home. "The secret is consistency, Mr. Johnson," Frank explained. "Every day, at the same time, with the same patience. Old Mr. Wilson used to say the body needs routine to remember how to work." "Do you still keep in touch with this Mr. Wilson?" "No, boss. He passed away about 10 years ago, but my brother Brian remembers everything he taught. I can ask him to come by this weekend if you'd like." Richard felt hopeful at the possibility. If he could talk to someone who had actually been through the same situation, maybe he'd understand better what was happening. "You think your brother would really come?" "I'm sure of it. He always says he owes his life to Mr. Wilson. He'd be happy to help another child." That night, Richard was eating dinner when Michael did something unexpected. The boy, who was in the special chair, suddenly stretched his right leg and lightly kicked the table. Jennifer dropped her fork. "Richard, did you see that? He moved his leg." Richard pretended to be surprised, but his heart raced. Could it be that the exercises were actually working after just 2 days? "It must have been an involuntary reflex," he said, trying not to show too much excitement. "Reflex nothing. He used strength. I saw it." Jennifer stood up and picked Michael up in her arms. "Michael, sweetheart, do it again for Mommy. Move your little leg." Michael laughed and tried to move his legs again, but nothing happened. Jennifer was frustrated, but Richard noticed the boy was trying, really making an effort. "I'll call Dr. William first thing tomorrow," Jennifer decided. "I need to tell him about this." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. If Dr. William found out about the exercises with Frank, he would surely forbid them. Doctors like him didn't believe in alternative treatments. "Jennifer, maybe it's better to wait a few days. See if it happens again." "Wait. Richard, our son might be recovering. How can you suggest we wait?" "It's just, if it really was an involuntary reflex, like I said, there's no point in getting our hopes up." Jennifer looked at her husband suspiciously. There had been something odd about his behavior these past few days. Richard seemed more nervous, more evasive. "Are you hiding something from me?" she asked directly. "Of course not. Why would I hide anything about our son?" "I don't know. But you've been different since the day before yesterday. And this habit of taking Michael to the factory." Richard decided to change the subject, but he knew he wouldn't be able to keep the secret much longer. Jennifer was too smart to be fooled indefinitely. The next morning, Richard woke up to a call from Frank. "Mr. Johnson, my brother Brian arrived last night. He can meet with you today if you'd like." "Where?" "He's here at my place in Milltown. Do you know it?" Richard knew Milltown, a simple neighborhood where many of the factory workers lived. He'd never been inside a house there, but he knew how to get there. "I can come by at 2 in the afternoon, after lunch." "Perfect, boss. My brother is eager to help." Richard made up another work meeting and left the house alone. Milltown was a 15-minute drive from downtown Columbus. The houses were small but well kept, with yards where children played in the street. Frank's house was painted light blue, with a small porch in front. When Richard knocked on the door, he was greeted by a friendly woman around 40. "You must be Frank's boss," she said, smiling. "I'm Brenda, his wife. Come in, please." Richard felt awkward. He'd never visited an employee's home and wasn't sure how to act. The living room was small but clean and tidy. Family photos hung on the walls, and there was a 2-seater sofa with a floral cover. "Frank," Brenda called. "Mr. Johnson is here." Frank appeared with a tall, strong man around 35. Richard immediately recognized the family resemblance, especially the expressive eyes that Frank also had. "Mr. Johnson, this is my brother Brian." Brian stepped forward and shook Richard's hand firmly. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Johnson. Frank told me about your boy. I want to help, however I can. Brian, tell him about your recovery, Frank urged. Brian sat on the sofa and began telling his story. Richard listened, fascinated, as the man recounted how he'd spent 3 months immobilized after falling from a tree at age 5. My mother was desperate, Brian said. She took me to 3 different doctors, and they all said the same thing. I'd never walk again. That's when a neighbor recommended old Mr. Wilson over in Mill Creek. What was this old Mr. Wilson like? Richard asked. A simple man who worked the land. But he had knowledge no one could explain. He said he'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from his grandfather. It was a family thing. Brian stood up and began demonstrating some of the exercises he'd learned. They were simple movements, but done with precision and patience. The most important thing, Brian explained, is believing it will work. Old Mr. Wilson used to say our bodies always want to heal, but sometimes they need help remembering how. Richard spent 2 hours at Frank's house, listening to stories and learning exercises. When he left, he was convinced he should continue the treatment, even if he had to keep it secret from Jennifer. In the following days, Richard developed an elaborate routine to take Michael to the factory without raising his wife's suspicions. He invented meetings, urgent production issues, visits from important clients. Jennifer started complaining about how much her husband was working, but she didn't suspect the real reasons. Michael was responding better and better to the exercises. On the 5th day, he managed to wiggle the toes on both feet. On the 8th day, he bent his knee when Frank massaged his thigh. Richard was thrilled but worried about how Jennifer would react when she found out. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. The discovery happened unexpectedly. Jennifer had forgotten her purse at home and came back to get it during lunch. When she arrived at the factory, she heard laughter coming from the office. She climbed the stairs quietly and opened the door without knocking. The scene left her speechless. Michael was lying on the floor, laughing while Frank massaged his legs. Richard was kneeling beside them, watching intently. "What's going on here?" Jennifer shouted, startling everyone. Richard turned pale. Frank stood up quickly, wiping his hands on his overalls. Michael began crying from the shock. "Jennifer, I can explain..." "Explain what, Richard? That you're letting a mechanic play with our sick son? That you're exposing Michael to this quackery?" "It's not quackery, ma'am." Frank tried to intervene. "My brother..." "Shut your mouth," Jennifer snapped. "Who do you think you are, touching my son? You're a mechanic. You know nothing about medicine." Richard picked Michael up, trying to calm him. "Jennifer, please let me explain. The exercises are working. Michael moved his legs several times this week." "Working?" Jennifer laughed bitterly. "And you believe that?" "Richard, where is your head? We spent a fortune on the best doctors in the country, and you're telling me a mechanic knows more than them?" "Frank has experience, Jennifer. His brother went through the same thing and recovered completely." "Experience?" Jennifer was beside herself. "Richard, you've lost your mind. I'm calling Dr. Parker right now to tell him about this madness." She snatched Michael from Richard's arms and stormed out of the factory. Frank stood in the middle of the room, embarrassed and worried. "Mr. Johnson, maybe it's best to stop the exercises. I don't want to cause trouble in your family." "No, Frank, you did nothing wrong. The problem is my wife doesn't understand. But she's Michael's mother. If she doesn't want, she'll understand when she sees the results. Michael is getting better, I'm sure of it." But Richard was wrong about Jennifer's ability to accept the situation. When he got home that afternoon, he found his wife on the phone with Dr. Parker, recounting everything she'd seen. "Doctor, you need to talk to my husband," Jennifer was saying. "He's letting a factory worker give Michael a massage. He says it's treatment, but I know it's nonsense." Richard Johnson approached and gestured for Jennifer to hang up the phone, but she ignored him. "Yes, doctor. I'll bring Michael in tomorrow for you to examine him. I want to make sure these exercises haven't caused any problems." When Jennifer hung up, she looked at Richard with a look of disappointment he had never seen before. "Richard, how could you do this to me? How could you make a decision about our son without consulting me? Jennifer, I was going to tell you once I was sure it was working. I didn't want to raise false hopes. False hopes? What about my hopes for real treatments, with real doctors? Do you think I'm wasting time and money for nothing? That's not it, honey. It's just that you don't trust me, Jennifer interrupted. You'd rather believe a mechanic than your own wife. The argument lasted all night. Jennifer threatened not to let Richard see Michael until he promised never to do exercises with Frank Miller again. Richard tried to argue, pointing out the small progress he had observed, but Jennifer wouldn't budge. First thing tomorrow we're going to Dr. William Parker's office, she declared. And if he confirms these exercises could have harmed Michael in any way, I'll sue your employee. Richard barely slept that night. He knew Dr. William Parker was a traditional doctor who didn't believe in alternative treatments. He would likely discourage continuing the exercises, even if Michael was improving. The next morning, Dr. William Parker examined Michael thoroughly. He was a man in his 50s, formal and serious, speaking with authority about every aspect of the boy's condition. Mrs. Jennifer, I can confirm the exercises haven't caused any physical harm, he said after the examination. But I must warn you about the risks of unscientific treatments. What kind of risks, doctor? Jennifer asked. Mainly the risk of fostering unrealistic expectations. You could waste time and energy on something that won't work when you should be focusing on proven treatments. Richard couldn't hold back. But doctor, Michael is moving his legs. Yesterday, he bent his knee during the exercise. Dr. William Parker looked at Richard condescendingly. Mr. Johnson, it's natural for you to interpret any movement as a sign of improvement, but involuntary movements are common with this type of injury. They don't mean recovery. What if they're not involuntary? Richard insisted. What if Michael is really getting better? If there were real progress, I'd be the first to detect it. You need to accept that Michael's injury is irreversible and focus on adapting his life to this new reality. Jennifer left the office satisfied, feeling validated in her stance. Richard, however, was more confused than ever. Dr. William Parker had said there was no harm, but he had also dismissed any possibility of improvement. There, Richard, Jennifer said in the car. Now you've heard it from a specialist. No more experiments with our son. Jennifer, Dr. William Parker only said there was no harm. He didn't say we should stop. Richard, Jennifer snapped. Don't you understand? He said it's a waste of time, that we're fostering false hopes. But what if we're right? What if Michael really is improving? Jennifer pulled the car over and looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. Richard, I want Michael to recover too, more than anything in the world, but I can't live on illusions. I need to accept reality and fight for what's best for our son. And I am fighting. I'm trying everything possible. No, Richard. You're clinging to false hope because you can't accept that Michael might never walk again. Jennifer's words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was fooling himself, seeing improvements where there were none. But what if she was wrong? What if there really was a chance? That afternoon, Richard returned to the factory troubled. Frank approached him as soon as he saw him. Hey there, Mr. Johnson. How was the doctor's visit? He said the exercises didn't do any harm, but he also doesn't believe Michael is improving. Frank shook his head, discouraged. Doctors never believe in these things, boss. My brother Brian went through the same thing. They said he'd never walk even when he was already starting to move his legs. Frank, my wife is really upset. She doesn't want me to continue with the exercises. I understand, Mr. Johnson. Family has to stick together. If the missus doesn't want it, it's better to stop. Richard was surprised by Frank's reaction. He expected the mechanic to try convincing him to keep going, but the man seemed genuinely concerned about family harmony. You're not upset? Of course I'm sad, boss. I think I could have helped Michael. But I know family fights hurt everyone, especially the kids. That night, Richard came home resolved to accept Jennifer's decision. He found his wife in the kitchen making dinner while Michael played on the floor with some toys. Jennifer, I talked to Frank today. He understands our position. We won't do the exercises anymore. Jennifer smiled for the first time in days. Thank you, Richard. I know it was hard for you, but we did the right thing. I hope so. During dinner, Michael was quiet, unlike the past few days. Richard noticed the boy seemed less lively, as if he missed something, but he tried not to dwell on it. In the following weeks, the family returned to their routine before the incident with Frank. Jennifer resumed regular appointments with Dr. Parker and began researching the experimental surgery in Switzerland. Richard focused back on the factory's problems, trying not to think about the exercises that might have helped Michael. But Michael was regressing. The small movements he'd made during the exercises with Frank had completely disappeared. The boy became apathetic again, showing no interest in anything around him. Richard watched with a heavy heart, but didn't dare mention it to Jennifer. A month after stopping the exercises, Richard was in the factory office when he got an unexpected visit. Jennifer appeared at the door, pale and red-eyed. "Richard, I need to talk to you." "What happened? Is something wrong with Michael?" "No. Well, yes. Richard, I made a terrible mistake." Richard was alarmed. Jennifer rarely admitted mistakes so easily. "What mistake, Jennifer?" "I went to Frank's house this morning." Richard froze. What had Jennifer done? "You went to his house? Why?" "Because Michael wasn't doing well." "Not at all. He wasn't laughing anymore, wasn't playing, always seemed sad. And I remembered how excited he was when he came here, when he did the exercises." "And what did Frank say?" Jennifer began to cry. "He took me to meet his brother, Richard. Brian. I saw with my own eyes a man who had the same injury as Michael and now walks normally." Richard stood up from his chair, feeling a mix of relief and anger. "And now? What do you want to do?" "I want to apologize. To you and to Frank. And I want Michael to start the exercises again." "Jennifer, are you sure? After everything that happened?" "I am. I saw Brian walking, running, playing with his kids. I talked to his mother, Mrs. Thompson, who told me the whole story. Richard, I was wrong, completely wrong." Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For weeks, he had carried the guilt of giving up on the exercises, of yielding to Jennifer's pressure against his own instincts. "Then let's go find Frank right now." They found Frank on the assembly line, working on an engine part. When he saw Jennifer approaching, the mechanic tensed up, probably expecting a scolding or complaint. "Frank," Jennifer said, her voice trembling, "I need to apologize. You were trying to help my son, and I treated you poorly." Frank was embarrassed by the situation. "No need to apologize, Mrs. Jennifer. You're a mother, you were protecting your son. But you were protecting him too, in your own way, with your knowledge, and I didn't recognize that. The important thing is that now we can work together for Michael," Frank said, smiling. Jennifer nodded. "I want to learn the exercises too. I want to be part of my son's recovery." From that day on, the family united around the shared goal of helping Michael. Jennifer cancelled the appointments with Dr. William Parker and scrapped the plans for surgery in Switzerland. Instead, she began observing Frank's exercises, learning every movement, every technique. Brian started visiting the factory 3 times a week, teaching new exercises and sharing stories of his own recovery. Michael, who had grown depressed during the weeks without exercises, began showing joy and interest again. The recovery wasn't linear. There were days of progress and days of setbacks, but little by little, Michael improved. First, the toe movements returned, then knee flexion, then small hip motions. Jennifer became the treatment's biggest advocate. She studied everything about spinal cord injuries, alternative recovery methods, and cases similar to Michael's. She discovered there were other professionals like old Mr. Wilson, simple people who had developed effective techniques through practical experience. 3 months after restarting the exercises, Michael managed to stand with the support of a table for a few seconds. The entire factory stopped to witness the historic moment. The workers, who had followed the story from the beginning, cried with emotion alongside the family. Frank was radiant, but also worried. He knew the more Michael improved, the higher the expectations for his full recovery would grow. And not every case had a happy ending like Brian's. "Mr. Richard," he said privately, "it's important to be patient. Brian took almost a year to walk on his own." Every case is different. I know, Frank, but it's already a miracle to see Michael standing, even if just for a few seconds. It is, boss. But Mrs. Jennifer is getting too anxious. We have to be careful not to push the boy too hard. Richard knew Frank was right. Jennifer had become obsessed with Michael's recovery, increasing the frequency of exercises, researching new methods, timing every small improvement. Jennifer, Richard tried to talk to his wife. Maybe we should slow down a little. Michael is pushing himself hard. Slow down, Richard, our son is recovering. Every day could make a difference. But he needs to play too to be a child. He can't live just doing exercises. He'll have time to play when he's walking normally. Richard realized Jennifer had transferred her obsession from traditional doctors to alternative exercises. The problem wasn't the methods, but the anxious way she approached recovery. The situation reached its limit when Michael, during a more intense exercise, started crying and asked to stop. "No, son," Jennifer insisted. "Just 10 more minutes. You can do it." "I don't want to anymore, Mom. It hurts." "It doesn't hurt. It's just a little effort." Frank stepped in gently. "Mrs. Jennifer, when a child says it hurts, it's best to stop. Old Mr. Wilson always said pushing too hard can hinder recovery." But he was doing so well, and he'll keep doing well, but at his own pace with patience. Jennifer felt frustrated but agreed to stop the exercise. Michael relaxed in his father's arms, relieved he didn't have to continue. That night, Richard spoke seriously with Jennifer about respecting Michael's limits. "He's just a child, Jennifer. He can't carry all this pressure on his shoulders." "I know, Richard. I'm just so afraid of wasting the opportunity." "We're not wasting anything. Michael is improving at his own pace. We have to trust the process." In the following months, the family found a better balance. The exercises continued, but more relaxed, respecting Michael's mood and energy. The boy started playing, laughing, and being a child again. Frank became almost part of the family. He had lunch at Richard's house on Sundays, brought his wife Brenda to meet Jennifer, and shared stories about Brian's recovery to encourage Michael on tough days. The transformation at the factory was also remarkable. Richard began paying more attention to the workers, learning their personal stories, and valuing knowledge that didn't come from universities. He created a program where experienced workers could teach practical tricks to the newer ones. Michael turned 4 during his treatment. The party was at the factory with all the employees joining in. The boy could already take a few steps holding onto adults' hands, and his joy was contagious. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Dr. William Parker heard about Michael's recovery through medical circles in Columbus. Skeptical at first, he asked to examine the boy again. "This is extraordinary," he admitted after the checkup. "Scientifically, I can't explain this improvement." "Doctor," Richard said, "maybe not everything needs a scientific explanation to work." "You're right. I apologize for discouraging the treatment. Sometimes we doctors get so stuck in what we learned from books that we forget to observe what happens in practice." Dr. Parker became interested in Frank and Brian's methods, documenting Michael's case to present at medical conferences. He wanted to show colleagues that traditional medicine could learn from folk knowledge. Michael's full recovery happened on an ordinary day. It was a Thursday afternoon, 6 months after restarting the exercises. He was playing on the office floor when he suddenly stood up and walked to Frank. "Uncle Frank," he shouted, as if walking was the most natural thing in the world. Frank froze for a few seconds, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then he scooped Michael into his arms and began to cry. "Richard! Jennifer, come here! Michael walked on his own!" The news spread through the factory in minutes. Workers dropped their tools to see Michael walking down the halls. Some cried, others applauded, all sharing the family's joy. Jennifer came running and found Michael walking back and forth in the workshop, smiling proudly at his achievement. "Mommy, look, I can walk." She picked him up and cried as she hadn't in months. But this time, they were tears of happiness, relief, and gratitude. "Thank you, Frank," she said, hugging the mechanic. "Thank you for never giving up on my son." "I'm the one who's grateful, Mrs. Jennifer, for believing in me, for letting me help." Richard watched the scene with a full heart. His family had completely transformed over those months. They had learned about humility, about valuing different kinds of knowledge, about the importance of believing when all seemed lost. Michael's story spread through Columbus and the surrounding area. Other families with children in similar situations sought out Frank and Brian. They never charged anything for their teachings, always willing to share what they knew. Richard decided to create an alternative rehabilitation center at the factory itself, with Frank as the coordinator. It was a space where traditional and modern knowledge came together to help people in recovery. Dr. William became a partner in the project, offering medical support for the more complex cases. He had learned that medicine could be far more effective when combined with time-tested folk wisdom. Michael, now 5 years old and walking perfectly, became something of a mascot for the factory. He ran through the halls, played with the workers, and showed that miracles could happen when people came together for a common goal. Frank was promoted to supervisor of the new rehabilitation area, but never lost the humility that defined him. He still wore his worn-out cap and greeted every co-worker by name. Brian moved to Columbus to help with the project. He brought his family and became the lead instructor for the recovery exercises. His personal story inspired other patients not to give up. Jennifer created a support group for mothers of children with special needs. She shared her experience, taught about the importance of being open to different treatment possibilities, and showed that love and persistence could overcome any obstacle. The Johnson family's transformation was reflected throughout the company. Richard implemented an employee appreciation program offering scholarships for the workers' children, creating communal spaces, and recognizing practical knowledge gained through experience. The factory became a model for how businesses could go beyond profit, actively contributing to the community's well-being. Delegations from other states came to learn about the Alternative Rehabilitation Project. Michael grew up knowing his recovery hadn't been a stroke of luck, but the result of love, dedication, and the wisdom of ordinary people who believed in him when experts said there was no hope. Years later, when Michael was in school and running in the playground like any normal child, he still visited Frank at the factory. The mechanic, now gray-haired but with the same gentle smile, always asked about his studies, his dreams, and his plans for the future. "Uncle Frank," Michael would say, "when I grow up, I want to help other kids like you helped me." "And you will, Michael. You're proof that nothing's impossible when we don't give up." Michael's story became a legend in Columbus. Told and retold, it inspired other families to seek alternatives, to value traditional knowledge, and never to accept no as a final answer. Richard and Jennifer, now with streaks of gray in their hair, looked back and realized that Michael's temporary paralysis had, paradoxically, been the best thing to happen to their family. It had taught them values no school or university could ever impart. Frank retired at 60, but still visited the factory as a volunteer. His knowledge had been documented, systematized, and taught to new professionals. But nothing could replace his intuition, his patience, his ability to see possibilities where others saw only limitations. The Alternative Rehabilitation Center at Johnson Auto Parts became a national benchmark. Doctors, physical therapists, and researchers came to study the methods developed by Frank and Brian. But the secret to success wasn't in the techniques, it was in the love, the hope, and the refusal to accept that some situations had no solution. Michael graduated as a physical therapist years later, specializing in pediatric rehabilitation. His first patient was a 4-year-old girl who had suffered an accident similar to his own. When the child's parents said the doctors had no hope, Michael smiled and replied, "I know a mechanic who would disagree with those doctors." And the story continued, generation after generation, proving that true wisdom doesn't come just from books, but from experience, compassion, and the courage to believe in the impossible. Johnson Auto Parts was never the same after Michael's recovery. It became a place where people mattered more than machines, where different kinds of knowledge were respected, where miracles were accepted as a natural part of life. Richard, now elderly, often walked through the factory halls, remembering the day a simple mechanic changed his life forever. Frank had taught much more than rehabilitation exercises. He had taught humility, the value of every person, regardless of their social standing, and to never underestimate the power of common wisdom. Jennifer became one of the leading advocates for alternative treatments in the region. Her transformation from skeptic to believer inspired other mothers to keep an open mind when facing challenges with their children. The legacy of old Mr. Wilson, the country healer, lived on through Brian, Frank, and now Michael. Knowledge passed from father to son, from teacher to student, saving lives and restoring hope. The small, yellowed photo Frank had shown Richard on that first day was still tucked in his wallet. But now there were other photos beside it. Michael taking his first steps, Michael running in the schoolyard, Michael graduating as a physical therapist, Michael helping other children. Each photo told part of a bigger story, about how love and persistence could overcome any obstacle, about how wisdom could come from the most unexpected places, about how miracles happened when people believed in one another. The factory kept producing auto parts, but its most important product was hope. Families from all over America sought out the Alternative Rehabilitation Center, looking not just for treatment, but for the certainty that they should never give up. Michael, now an adult and a father of two, often took his children to visit Grandpa Frank at the factory. The kids ran through the same halls where their father had taken his first steps, heard the same stories about perseverance and love, and learned the same values that had transformed the Johnson family. And when someone asked Michael about the secret to his recovery, he always answered, "There was no secret, it was just a mechanic who believed in me when no one else did, and that made all the difference." The end. Now tell us what you thought of this touching story. Do you believe Michael made the right choice in trusting Frank? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your participation means so much to us. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartwarming stories like this one.